like to thank everybody for taking the time to have this discussion with me, and I'd like to thank the organizers of having me come in and talk to you a little bit about real world evidence and what it means in the current state, as well as in the evolution of how we will proceed with drug development, drug approval, and then ongoing evaluation and surveillance of drug effectiveness and safety in the next decades. So to begin, uh, I just want to highlight what are really the important questions that we are asking during a drug development program. And in order to uh, appreciate these questions, we have to understand the stakeholders that are involved. The first and most important stakeholder, of course, of any drug development process is, in fact, the patient. The patient wants to know, will this drug work for me? Is it safe for me? Is it more effective and safe than other drugs? Can I afford it? Will I have access to it? And oddly enough, we need to also ensure the patient that the doctors know how to use it properly for their condition and their particular case. The next stakeholder that we need to think about are healthcare providers, our physicians, our nurses, everyone that's providing healthcare to these patients. And the questions that healthcare providers need to be asking are, will it work and be safe or tolerable for all my patients, for all of them, for some of them? If not, which ones, under what conditions, and can my patient take it as it's needed? In other words, can my patient be compliant with the treatment? Is it more effective and safe than the alternatives? How will my patient rank this new treatment in terms of disease management, the impact on their quality of life, their productivity, their overall satisfaction with the treatment, and ease of use? And of course, can my patient access these treatments? And what do I need to know as a physician to make sure I'm using it properly? Society has another set of questions. It wants to understand what is the impact of the disease. In other words, how many patients will get it? What is the morbidity and mortality? What is the economic burden? How does this economic burden compare to other diseases? Do I need to make this disease a priority? How will the treatment affect the impact of the disease in society? How much will it cost? What is the expected return on investment in terms of efficacy of treating this disease? Is it better or worse than other treatments? And is this return of investment better or worse than treatments for other diseases? We don't often think about this, but there isn't an infinite amount of resources and financial backing to pay for everything, and sometimes HMOs and ministers of health and secretaries of health, in conjunction with their colleagues at the finance departments, have to decide where to put the resources and the money. So these are kinds of questions that society needs to address when we're looking at a new treatment coming on board. Payers, these are the insurance companies or the patients, whichever that pays for the treatment. They need to know if the drug or the treatment is cost effective. What are the incremental cost effective ratios versus other alternatives? What are the important things to consider in these cost effectiveness ratios, like clinical endpoints, patient reported outcomes, or quality of life? And does it warrant coverage by the insurance plan? Finally, and I say finally, although we never think of regulatory agencies as finally, we always think of regulatory agencies as the first stakeholder we need to work with. But at the end, they are the ones that have to take into consideration all the other things, I think. But regulatory agencies are primarily focused to see if the drug, if there's evidence supporting the efficacy and safety in the drug under controlled experimental conditions. And the question that needs to be asked after that is, can this evidence be extrapolated to the general target populations? Are there any precautions, warnings that we need to issue Do we need to implement surveillance or for safety or effectiveness after approval? And in some cases, agencies might wonder about comparative effectiveness and safety versus alternatives, but this isn't their primary um, purpose. So what do we do in answering these questions? We typically do a randomized clinical trial, the experimental interventional types of studies. We start with a target population that theoretically are all patients that have the target conditions. We pick a study sample that fulfills the inclusion exclusion criteria, and typically in phase two, phase three randomized clinical trials, these are highly selected patients that are referred for treatment to academic research centers. We randomize treatment allocation. This prevents selection and indication bias, so neither the patient typically or the physician know what treatment they are receiving, although in some cases we may be implementing open label designs when there's an acute need, or in some cases in oncology when there are no alternative treatments. But the typical paradigm is one of double blind design. The experimental and placebo or standard of care are are administered as according to a predefined protocol that the academic research are adhering to, and these are all ideal experimental conditions. And really, there's nothing wrong with this because we want to know if given the best opportunity to work, does this treatment work? At the end of the study, we have conclusions regarding the efficacy under ideal conditions and safety in a small of highly selected patients, but still we want to make sure that there are no warning signals with respect to safety, even with this small population. When we think about it, though, if you look at the design of a typical phase two, phase three randomized controlled clinical trial, it really addresses primarily the needs of the regulators. The patient's uh, concerns are addressed a lot less, but quite a bit, because the patient will know if the drug works and is safe under ideal conditions. So that's a good piece of evidence to make the patient comfortable that it could be used for their particular case. Healthcare providers are also well informed, but not absolutely answering all their questions. Payers and society a lot uh, come with a lot less information from a randomized clinical trial. So what is the solution? We need to turn to real world evidence or real world studies to try and fill these knowledge gaps that we haven't been able to completely address with the typical randomized clinical trial. In real world studies, we start with the same target populations, which is all the patients that have the target conditions. However, the study sample now are the patients that have the disease and can receive the treatment, but are treated by community physicians. And there's very little selection towards an enriched population in this case, because physicians will use the treatment as they feel is best for their patients. Typically, we don't have blinded real world studies. This causes a possibility for indication bias, and we have to exercise some caution when interpreting these results sometimes, but there are statistical methods to deal with this. Patients and physicians know what treatment they are getting. Uh, Treatment and follow-up is done under real world conditions, administered by community physicians under routine care. And the outcomes that we look at are efficacy under non-ideal conditions. I'm sorry, there's a typo here, and safety in a larger number of patients. We also look at quality of life and economics. An important aspect of real world studies is that we can evaluate or get a hint of what drives medical decision making. In other words, what what kind of thinking goes into the physician's decision to use one treatment or another. Basically, The real world studies will allow us to determine if the treatment is effective and safe in the real world setting and compare it with alternatives. If it's if it's yes for all patients, which is unlikely, the question will be, is it better for some patients than others? What is it that we can do to optimize treatment with respect to efficacy and safety? And if it's better for some patients, which ones and why? And we use this information to better manage our overall patient population. If it's not safe and effective for all patients, then it might be only safe and effective for some patients. Which ones are they? And this allows us to assess determinants of response to treatment. All of these are very important considerations when we're looking at how we're managing patients in the real world, and how these drugs that or treatments or surgical procedures that we approve in early clinical studies can be properly used to benefit the patients for which they were designed. Essentially, when we think about what real world evidence and what real world studies do, they identify a treatment gap. They address stakeholder questions that are relevant to these treatment gaps. They formulate a hypothesis. They generate research questions. They conduct the study. And we keep doing this. We keep going through this process until we achieve treatment optimization for our patients. This is the ultimate goal of real world studies. And this has been how real world evidence and real world studies have been used and perceived in the past. This is changing quite a bit now, or actually, I should say, it's not really changing. It's just a lot more interest and focus and attention has been placed on these kinds of questions, realizing that they are as important to be addressed as the questions we are addressing in phase 2, phase 3 randomized controlled trials. How do we conduct real world studies? We have basically the challenge is getting the data, and we can get the data through primary data collection, through observational studies, such as prospective cohort studies, retrospective cohort studies, or retrospective case control studies, or we use things like registries, patient or disease registries, and treatment registries. And more recently, thanks to the evolution of information technology and the wider acceptance of electronic medical records, we can start using electronic medical records, administrative or insurance databases, existing registries, hospital records, pharmacy databases. Patient-derived data are becoming quite fashionable now with wearable devices and patient self-reporting. And in some cases, even social media may be used to complement information that we're using in real world studies. So the FDA has put out some guidelines on how we will be conducting real world studies and use them as part of the file or the filing that will be provided to the FDA um, to support the efficacy and safety of potentially approvable or even approved treatments. And their position is that you can't use a single source of data. They would like to probably see a combination of observational studies complemented with existing databases to generate a good bank of real world data that allow you to do a lot of analyses, subgroup analyses, etc., to make sure that there are no biases creeping in that could affect the results and interpretation of these results. If we look at it from another perspective, when we think about what we're doing as a totality in the entire product life cycle, we begin with some patient registries to try to understand the, the natural history of the disease, understand who's at risk, who might get it, who might get more sick with the disease, and who might not. COVID-19 is an excellent example of something like this, by which we know some patients are infected and get terribly sick, where others remain asymptomatic, it would be good for us to try to understand what differentiates these two phenotypes of patients. So incorporating patient registries would certainly give us a lot of the answers to these kinds of questions, right? Then we identify treatments, we get some initial licensing, we start conducting randomized clinical trials, and then we get the treatment approved under full license, and then we do some phase 4 trials that allow us to see if we can study certain subgroups or address some of the outcomes that we weren't looking at in our phase 3 studies, and to a certain degree to get um, visibility into the community uh, for these newly approved treatments. At the same time, we now start incorporating registries that are based on the disease. We bring in hospital data, and we have patients that are participating in several observational studies and registries. And you can see that this amount of data is a lot more than the data that has been generated in randomized clinical trials. On top of this now, we will be adding electronic health record data, health insurance data, surveys, and biobanks, and this completes the entire um, comprehensive set of information that we will be using to assess the effectiveness, safety, uh, and and usefulness of approved medications, or to follow the treatment from its inception throughout its entire product life cycle. So based on this philosophy, the FDA now is seriously considering how the combination of real world evidence and the data or evidence generated at randomized clinical trials are going to become essential as evidence to support using these treatments for patient care, not just at the point of approval, but over a very longer period. This has generated what I call the 21st century evolution or revolution with respect to real world evidence. And as a clinical epidemiologist, I found all of this very interesting because we've been doing real world studies for hundreds of years. I've certainly been doing them for over 30 years, except we used to call them some other things. But now there's an interest and a very specific attention to these kinds of studies, and we've called them all real world evidence. So this isn't anything new to us, but what is new is the fact that organizations like the FDA, Health Canada, EMA, as well as healthcare providers, patients, and the industry are starting to pay particular attention to these kinds of studies, and the evidence generated from these kinds of studies are now being incorporated in decisions to approve or to use certain treatments. On that note, I'd just like to highlight the FDA framework for using real world studies or real world evidence programs. They have highlighted the use of pragmatic trials, simulating randomized controlled trials in real world settings. This would be a situation where you might have registries or administrative databases or electronic health records from which you can tap in and simulate a randomized controlled trial um, for an approved medication, or for a medication that might be repurposed for something else, or for a medication that you're looking for a new indication. They have also highlighted that they would be considering um, the use of synthetic controls, and this is an important step because quite often we need to understand that typically 50% of the patients participating in a randomized clinical trial will not be receiving the experimental treatment. And while that might be acceptable in some cases, in situations of rare disease or in situations of acute need, and acute need today is COVID-19, uh, we already know what standard of care will do. We already know what is happening on hundreds, if not thousands, of patients that have gone through the standard of care as it exists today. So we really don't need to accumulate more data on standard of care. We can easily enroll patients in single cohort studies with single arms and compare them to historical controls or controls that are in the data using appropriate statistical methodology. So the is FDA, Health Canada, and EMA. They're all willing to consider these kinds of designs if they're properly done. So as I mentioned earlier, the FDA has concluded that it will be evaluating the potential use of real-world evidence on a case-by-case basis to support a new indication of an approved drug, to satisfy post-approval study requirements, or even to change labelings of an approved drug, adding or changing an indication, adding a population, and to be incorporated in comparative effectiveness or safety assessments of of new medications. Some examples of how the FDA has collaborated with sponsors to uh, not only execute some of these studies, but to accept and approve certain treatments are. I'm going to be presenting these examples in the next few slides. In 2000, as early as 2017, the Harmony trial looked at bringing in data from real world sources, identifying clinical endpoints without actually having a case report form. In this example, this study was done in collaboration with GlaxoSmithKline, and it's one of the early examples of where the FDA was starting to look at real world evidence as a source to approve a change of an indication for a medication. Another example is juvenile idiopathic arthritis, where they use the My Studies app. My Studies app is an app that has been implemented by the FDA that is being used not only to identify patients for studies, but to actually enroll patients in real world evidence studies that patients self-report and their physicians also go in and add data without necessarily having to go through the traditional route of the randomized controlled trial. Atrial fib randomized clinical trial was another example where this was an education intervention program that was again sponsored and supported by the FDA and enrolled over 80,000 individuals with atrial fib in this real world evidence study that, again, as I said, was not only supported by the FDA, but evidence from this study were used um, to support FDA's decisions regarding these treatments. More specific treatments would be azithromycin and roflumilast, in COPD exacerbations. This is particularly interesting because it looks like a typical randomized clinical trial, except there were no visits to the doctors. Everything was done through a call center and a patient portal, and site electronic medical records were used to to collect the data and then conduct the analysis and reach a conclusion regarding the comparison of these two treatments for COPD exacerbations. And one particularly exciting study um, that was used not so long ago by the FDA was to approve the treatment of male breast cancer with iBrace, which was based entirely on electronic health records and real world data, allowing Pfizer to include male breast cancer as an indication for this anti-tumor drug. Shift Analytics,